Tonight, we journey to a time when angels weren't distant symbols, but beings who walked among humans, judges and warriors in a world on the brink of chaos. Hidden in the cliffs near the Dead Sea, a collection of manuscripts survived wars, revolts, and centuries of silence, preserving stories Rome later tried to erase. These scrolls tell of heavenly watchers, giants, and a cosmic struggle that shaped the destiny of humankind, yet, for nearly 2,000 years, their voices were nearly lost. The knowledge contained in these texts was too powerful, too unsettling for the empires and authorities that sought control. Communities copied, hid, and protected these writings in caves and jars, their secrets buried beneath stone and sand. Scholars only now are beginning to piece together what was preserved, what was forgotten, and how angels that once roamed freely were gradually pushed to the margins of history. So before we dive into a world of forbidden knowledge, celestial rebellion, and the hidden manuscripts that challenge everything we thought we knew about early Judaism and the Roman era, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Before Rome crushed Jerusalem and before the temple fell, a quiet act of preservation was already underway in the Judean desert. Hidden among limestone cliffs near the Dead Sea, Jewish scribes copied sacred writings with intense care, unaware that their work would outlast empires. These were not rebels or prophets shouting in streets, but disciplined men guarding memory. While history later called this age unstable, the scrolls reveal focus, not chaos. They whisper that something valuable was being protected, not from time, but from what was coming next. Long before later generations asked who decided which voices would survive history. During the Second Temple period, Judea existed under constant pressure from Roman authority. Taxes increased, governors rotated, and loyalty was measured by obedience. Different Jewish groups responded in different ways, some seeking cooperation, others withdrawal. One such response appears in the scrolls themselves, texts focused on law, purity, and order. These writings show a community convinced that truth required protection. Copying was slow, materials were costly, and mistakes were dangerous. Yet the work continued, suggesting urgency shaped by fear and expectation. The desert location offered isolation, silence, and safety from political eyes as tensions across Judea quietly intensified daily life. The manuscripts later called the Dead Sea Scrolls were not created in caves, but in rooms where scribes trained their hands to copy precisely. Using ink, reed pens, and parchment, they reproduced biblical books alongside interpretations and rules. Dates written by scholars place many of these texts between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after. This was a time when Rome tolerated religion, but crushed resistance. Knowledge itself became fragile. Words could inspire obedience or revolt, depending on who read them in a land where authority shifted quickly, and survival often depended on silence and discipline alone. As Roman control hardened, rumors of revolt spread across Judea. By the middle of the 1st century, violence felt inevitable. The scrolls reflect this tension without naming it directly. They speak of order, chosen paths, and separation from corruption. This language suggests a group preparing for crisis, not fantasy. Storing texts was an act of foresight. Libraries are not hidden unless danger is expected. When later generations found jars sealed in caves, they were witnessing a decision made under pressure, not accident. This choice preserved voices that would otherwise vanish, carrying beliefs forward into an uncertain future shaped by empire. This chapter begins where certainty ends and silence begins. Before theology hardened and canons formed, these writings existed simply to be read. They show Judaism alive with debate, angels, law, and fear of loss. Rome did not yet ban these ideas, but it made survival unstable. The desert offered distance from armies and politics. What was hidden here was not heresy, but memory. And as the storm approached Jerusalem, a library waited in stone, holding questions Rome never intended to preserve. These scrolls stand as proof that history often survives where power least expects, quietly, patiently, beyond reach of control. Judea did not fall into Roman hands overnight. By the 1st century before Christ, Roman influence crept into the region through politics, debt, and military presence, until independence became an illusion. Rome ruled through client kings, taxes, and fear, allowing local customs to survive only if they never threatened imperial control. To ordinary people, Roman order looked calm on the surface, but beneath it grew anger, humiliation, and the sense that something sacred was being slowly taken away. Herod the Great ruled Judea under Roman approval, rebuilding the temple while enforcing loyalty with violence. His death fractured the region, and Rome responded by tightening its grip. Governors replaced kings, soldiers filled streets, and taxes funded a distant empire. Every census and levy reminded the population that they were subjects, not partners. Religious life continued, but under watchful eyes. Rome did not fear prayers, but it feared movements that could unite belief with resistance. Within this pressure, Jewish society split into different paths. The Pharisees focused on law and daily practice, believing survival came through discipline and teaching. The Sadducees aligned closely with temple authority and cooperation with Rome. Zealots rejected compromise altogether, believing God alone ruled Israel and that violence was justified. Others withdrew entirely, choosing separation over confrontation. These groups argued fiercely, each convinced the future depended on their response to Roman power. This division created instability that Rome exploited. By keeping factions divided, authority remained uncontested. But division also produced fear. Any gathering could be mistaken for rebellion. Any text could be read as a call to action. Words became dangerous in a land where spies, informants, and soldiers were never far away. Religious writing was no longer just spiritual guidance. It carried political weight, whether intended or not. The community connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls appears shaped by this reality. Their texts emphasize order, obedience to divine law, and separation from corruption. This was not abstract theology. It was survival thinking. Rome controlled cities and roads, but the desert offered distance. In isolation, communities could live according to strict rules without attracting attention. Copying texts became an act of preservation rather than debate. As Roman pressure increased, rumors of revolt spread across Judea. By the middle of the 1st century after Christ, unrest was common and violence was expected. The scrolls were hidden before armies arrived, not after. This suggests foresight, not panic. Those who sealed them understood that once Rome moved openly, there would be no room for libraries, nuance, or memory. Judea under Rome was not silent, but it was watched. It was not ignorant, but cautious. The scrolls were born in this tension between faith and fear, belief and survival. They survived because someone understood that power always targets memory first, and that the safest place for truth is often far from the center of control. In that shadow, preservation mattered more than victory, and silence became a strategy, allowing belief to endure long after Rome itself would fade from history altogether completely. Qumran sits on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, a dry and isolated place that seems unsuitable for ordinary life. Yet, during the final centuries before the destruction of the temple, people lived, worked, and organized themselves there with clear purpose. Archaeological remains show communal buildings, ritual baths, pottery workshops, and writing spaces. This was not a random shelter or a temporary camp. It functioned as a structured settlement shaped by shared rules, discipline, and belief during a time when Judea itself was unstable and divided. Scholars have long debated who lived at Qumran, but most agree the community was closely connected to the scrolls found nearby. Ancient writers like Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder describe a Jewish group called the Essenes, known for strict purity laws, communal living, and separation from wider society. Many features described by these writers align closely with what archaeology and the scrolls reveal. This has led many researchers to cautiously link Qumran with an Essene-related movement, while acknowledging that certainty is limited. The scrolls themselves provide the clearest evidence of how this community lived and thought. Texts, such as the community rule, describe initiation rituals, shared meals, collective discipline, and punishment for breaking rules. Members surrendered personal property to the group and followed a strict hierarchy. These rules suggest a society built on order and obedience, not isolation for its own sake, but preparation for what they believed was a coming judgment. Life at Qumran was shaped by expectation and control rather than comfort. Daily life revolved around ritual purity. Archaeologists uncovered multiple stepped pools designed for immersion, showing how seriously cleanliness was taken. These practices went beyond temple requirements and reinforced separation from other Jews. This separation was not about superiority, but survival. The community believed corruption had spread through Jerusalem and the priesthood. Withdrawal to the desert allowed them to preserve what they saw as true law without interference from Roman authority or compromised leaders. Dating evidence places the main period of occupation between the 2nd century before Christ and the 1st century after. Coins, pottery styles, and radiocarbon tests support this timeline. The settlement appears to have been damaged by earthquake and later abandoned around the time of the Roman advance during the Jewish revolt. This timing matches the likely moment when the scrolls were hidden in nearby caves, suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. What matters most is restraint. Responsible scholarship avoids claiming Qumran was mysterious or secretive beyond evidence. It was strict, disciplined, and deeply religious, but grounded in real history. The people who lived there copied texts, debated law, and prepared for a future they believed was near. Their withdrawal preserved ideas that might otherwise have been lost. Qumran was not hiding from history, but waiting for it, and the scrolls remain the clearest voice of a community that chose silence, order, and preservation over power. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not a single book or a hidden gospel, but a large collection of manuscripts created over many generations. They include copies of biblical texts, legal writings, hymns, prayers, calendars, and interpretations of Scripture. Most were written in Hebrew, with others in Aramaic, and a few in Greek. Together, they reflect the diversity of Jewish thought during the Second Temple period, before later religious traditions narrowed what counted as acceptable belief. The scrolls show that faith at this time was alive, debated, and deeply concerned with law, angels, time, and the future. Among the most important manuscripts are copies of books later included in the Hebrew Bible. Nearly every biblical book appears, except Esther. Some exist in multiple versions, revealing that Scripture was not yet fixed into one final form. Psalms appear in different orders, and some passages differ slightly from later versions. This does not suggest corruption, but development. Sacred texts were still being shaped, copied, and discussed in a living religious environment, rather than preserved as untouchable objects. Alongside biblical books are commentaries known today as pesharim. These texts explain Scripture line by line, often applying ancient prophecies to events the community believed were happening in their own time. This shows how Scripture functioned as a lens for understanding history. The writers believed they were living in a critical moment and that ancient words spoke directly to their present reality. Interpretation was not abstract. It was urgent and tied to survival. The scrolls also contain rule texts that governed daily life. Documents like the community rule outline membership, discipline, leadership, and punishment. These writings reveal how structured the community was and how seriously order mattered. Other texts describe calendars that differ from the one used in Jerusalem. These calendars organize festivals and sacred time differently, showing that even the measurement of days was contested. Time itself carried religious meaning, and disagreement could separate communities. Hymns and prayers form another large portion of the collection. These writings express humility, fear, hope, and devotion. They speak of angels, divine judgment, and the struggle between light and darkness. Unlike later liturgy, these prayers often emphasize cosmic conflict and human weakness. They reflect a worldview where unseen forces were active and history moved toward a final resolution guided by God. Finally, there are writings that never entered the biblical canon. These include works like Enochic texts and other compositions that expand on stories found only briefly in Scripture. Their presence shows they were valued and read, not fringe curiosities. The Dead Sea Scrolls are evidence that Judaism before the temple's destruction was complex and unfinished. They do not rewrite history, but they reveal how much was later simplified or forgotten when belief became fixed and controlled by authority alone. These manuscripts survived because they were hidden before violence erased libraries and voices. What remains is not mystery, but context, a record of belief before it hardened into canon and before power decided which words would speak for everyone. During the Second Temple period, angels were not distant symbols or vague metaphors. They were understood as real beings actively involved in the world, carrying out divine will in history. Jewish texts from this era describe angels as messengers who delivered commands, warriors who fought unseen battles, judges who carried out punishment, and teachers who revealed hidden knowledge. This belief was not fringe. It existed across multiple Jewish traditions long before later Christian theology reshaped the idea of angels into gentler, abstract figures. The Hebrew Bible already contained angelic appearances, but Second Temple writings expanded these roles dramatically. Angels were no longer only visitors who appeared briefly and disappeared. They became organized forces with names, ranks, and specific responsibilities. Texts spoke of angels assigned to nations, angels overseeing natural elements, and angels recording human actions. This reflected a worldview where heaven and earth were closely connected, and where history unfolded through both human and non-human agents working together. The Dead Sea Scrolls reflect this expanded angelology clearly. Hymns and rule texts frequently mention angels participating in worship alongside humans. Some prayers describe joint praise, where angels and the faithful form a single community across heaven and earth. This suggests that for the writers, angels were not distant observers, but present partners in religious life. The boundary between the divine realm and human activity felt thin and active, rather than sealed and unreachable. Angels also played a role in judgment and warfare. Several scrolls describe a coming conflict between forces of light and darkness, led by angelic commanders. Human members of the community believed they would fight alongside angels in a final battle, guided by divine order. This belief was not fantasy in their minds. It gave meaning to discipline, obedience, and separation from society. Life was preparation for participation in a cosmic struggle that was already unfolding beyond human sight. Some Jewish texts from this period also portray angels as teachers. They reveal calendars, laws, and mysteries hidden from ordinary understanding. Knowledge itself was sometimes seen as transmitted from heaven through angelic intermediaries. This helps explain why certain writings focused so heavily on correct timekeeping and ritual order. If angels governed time and law, then following the correct calendar was not a preference, but obedience to cosmic structure. It is important to understand that these beliefs existed before later debates about theology and doctrine. During the Second Temple era, there was no single authority deciding which angel ideas were acceptable. Diversity was normal. Some groups emphasized angels heavily, while others focused more on law or temple worship. The scrolls preserve one side of this spectrum, not an invention, but a reflection of beliefs widely discussed at the time. Angels in this world were powerful, structured, and involved. They explained why history felt unstable, and why justice sometimes seemed delayed. They filled the gap between human suffering and divine control. Only later would these ideas become uncomfortable, simplified, or reduced. In the Second Temple period, angels were not decorations of belief. They were part of how people understood reality itself, guiding history quietly while empires rose and prepared to fall. Among the many angel traditions circulating during the Second Temple period, one story stood apart for its intensity and lasting influence. This was the tradition of the Watchers, a group of heavenly beings described as descending to earth, crossing boundaries meant to remain sealed and triggering a chain of disaster that reshaped human history. The roots of this story appear briefly in the book of Genesis, where sons of God take human wives. But later Jewish texts expanded this short passage into a detailed and unsettling narrative that many communities took seriously. In these expanded accounts, the Watchers weren't evil from the beginning. They were angels assigned to observe humanity, to watch over the world rather than interfere with it. Over time, according to the tradition, some of these beings chose to abandon their role. They descended to earth, took human partners, and revealed forbidden knowledge. This included teachings about warfare, metalworking, cosmetics, astrology, and enchantments. Knowledge that was not meant for humans arrived too early and without restraint, upsetting the balance of creation. The consequences described in these texts were severe. The offspring of these unions were giants, beings of immense strength who consumed resources and brought violence to the earth. Human society collapsed under their presence, and the natural order itself was corrupted. This was not portrayed as a simple moral failure, but as a cosmic breach. Heaven and earth were no longer in their proper places. The flood narrative later associated with Noah was interpreted by many writers as a response to this angelic rebellion, not just human wrongdoing. What makes the Watchers tradition historically important is how widely it's circulated. Versions of this story appear in texts like the Book of Enoch, fragments of which were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. These writings were copied and preserved, showing they were valued and read, not dismissed. For many Jewish groups, the Watchers explained why evil existed so deeply in the world, and why judgment was delayed, but inevitable. It placed responsibility not only on humans, but on cosmic forces that had failed their duty. This tradition also shaped how angels were understood. Angels were powerful, but not beyond choice or consequence. They could rebel, be punished, and imprisoned. Some texts describe fallen watchers bound beneath the earth, awaiting final judgment. This idea of imprisoned angels later appears in early Christian writings, showing continuity rather than invention. The Watchers weren't mythological monsters. They were part of a serious attempt to explain suffering, injustice, and chaos in a world ruled by a just God. By the 1st century after Christ, the Watchers tradition was influential but also controversial. Its portrayal of angels as physical, sexual, and capable of corruption raised difficult questions. It challenged simple ideas of divine order. Yet, its presence in respected texts shows it could not be ignored. The Watcher's story emerged because it addressed real fears about power, knowledge, and boundary breaking. It warned that even beings meant to guard creation could cause destruction when limits were crossed. This message would later become uncomfortable for institutions seeking clean lines between heaven and earth, and it is precisely for that reason that the Watchers would slowly be pushed to the edges of official belief. The name Enoch carried unusual weight in the world of Second Temple Judaism. Though mentioned only briefly in the Hebrew Bible as a man who walked with God and did not die, later generations expanded his story into one of the most influential bodies of religious writing of the ancient world. The Book of Enoch was not a single text, but a collection of writings composed over centuries, read widely, copied carefully, and debated openly among Jewish communities long before Christianity emerged. During the centuries before the destruction of the temple, the Book of Enoch circulated as an authoritative explanation of angels, evil, judgment, and the structure of the cosmos. It offered answers that other scriptures left open. It explained why the world seemed broken, why evil persisted, and how divine justice would eventually arrive. For many readers, Enoch did not compete with Scripture. It expanded it. It filled the gaps left by brief biblical passages and turned them into a coherent worldview shaped by cosmic order. Fragments of Enoch found among the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm how respected the text once was. Multiple copies, written in Aramaic, show that it was read, studied, and preserved by the Qumran community. This alone demonstrates that Enoch was not marginal or secret. It was part of mainstream religious conversation during this period. Its ideas influenced how angels were understood, how history was interpreted, and how the future was imagined. At the same time, Enoch was not universally accepted. Some Jewish groups valued it highly, while others treated it with caution. The book contained bold ideas about fallen angels, cosmic judgment, and heavenly journeys. These themes challenge simpler interpretations of Scripture. Debate over Enoch shows that Judaism at this time was not unified around one set of texts or beliefs. Disagreement was normal, and authority had not yet solidified around a fixed canon. The influence of Enoch extended beyond Judaism. Early Christian writers were clearly familiar with it. The letter of Jude directly references Enoch by name, quoting a passage about divine judgment. This confirms that the book was still known and respected in the 1st century after Christ. Its language shaped early Christian ideas about angels, punishment, and the end of the age, even as later leaders became uncomfortable with its implications. What made Enoch persistent was its usefulness. It provided structure to chaos. It explained suffering without denying divine justice. It placed evil within a cosmic story rather than random failure. These explanations mattered deeply in a time of Roman domination, violence, and uncertainty. People needed a framework that made sense of power and injustice beyond human control. Over time, however, Enoch became difficult to manage. Its angels were too physical, its visions too detailed, and its authority too independent. As religious institutions grew stronger, they favored texts that supported clearer boundaries and centralized teaching. Enoch slowly faded from accepted scripture in many regions, but it never disappeared completely. Its survival in multiple traditions shows that some ideas are too deeply rooted to be erased. The name Enoch endured because it answered questions that history kept asking, even when institutions preferred silence. Among the discoveries at Qumran, the Enoch manuscripts stand out for their quantity, quality, and clarity about the community's priorities. Scholars have identified at least 5 distinct Aramaic copies of the Book of Enoch among the scrolls, some nearly complete, and others fragmentary. These manuscripts date from the 3rd century before Christ to the 1st century after, showing that Enoch was copied, preserved, and read over generations. The effort required to reproduce these texts indicates their importance to those living in the harsh desert environment. The Enoch fragments demonstrate that this tradition was more than peripheral or casual. Each copy reflects careful handwriting, consistent orthography, and attention to detail. Marginal notes and corrections suggest that scribes checked and double-checked their work, preserving both the message and accuracy. This level of care is evidence that Enoch was not treated as entertainment or myth, but as a guide to understanding angels, divine judgment, and human responsibility. The scrolls include sections that explain the watchers and their transgressions, the structure of heaven, the paths of celestial bodies, and the coming judgment. These writings show that the Qumran community valued knowledge about both the divine and the temporal. The Book of Enoch provided rules for living, warnings about sin, and reassurance that justice would be carried out even when human authorities failed. This made it both spiritual and practical in a period when survival was uncertain. Archaeological context confirms the importance of these texts. The manuscripts were found in caves near the main settlement, hidden carefully in jars to protect them from decay, theft, or destruction. They were stored alongside other biblical and sectarian writings, demonstrating that Enoch was considered part of a curated collection of essential works. The desert offered preservation not only through isolation, but also through intentional concealment, reflecting foresight about threats from Roman forces or rival groups. Comparing the Qumran Enoch fragments to later copies in Ge'ez, preserved by Ethiopian traditions, shows remarkable consistency. Core sections of the text remain unchanged over centuries, suggesting that scribes valued fidelity above personal interpretation. This fidelity also reveals the broader reach of Enochic literature. While debates existed about its authority, the persistence of these texts confirms they were widely read and influential. The fragments also highlight the community's focus on angels and the cosmic order. Detailed descriptions of celestial watchers, punishment of fallen angels, and guidance for righteous humans were repeated across multiple copies. This repetition indicates both theological emphasis and educational purpose. Young members of the community likely studied these texts carefully, memorizing lessons about obedience, vigilance, and divine justice. Qumran's Enoch manuscripts offer a window into a living tradition that combined law, cosmology, and eschatology. They prove that the Book of Enoch was not marginal, but central to at least one significant Jewish sect during the Second Temple period. The care with which it was copied and preserved speaks to its perceived authority and its role in shaping beliefs about angels, human conduct, and the ultimate unfolding of history. These fragments are tangible proof that Enoch mattered deeply and enduringly to a community facing both earthly and cosmic challenges. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, a particularly striking set of manuscripts is known as the Book of Giants. These fragments, written in Aramaic and dating to the 2nd century before Christ through the 1st century after, expand on the story of the Watchers in ways that are both vivid and terrifying. They describe the offspring of the angels and human women, beings of enormous size and strength, whose actions brought chaos and destruction to the earth. This was not metaphorical exaggeration. For the communities preserving these texts, the giants represented real threats to order, morality, and divine balance. The Book of Giants develops the angelic rebellion with a focus on consequences. The giants are depicted as aware of the wrongs committed by their angelic parents, and they fear the judgment that is to come. Dreams and visions appear frequently in the manuscripts, interpreted as warnings from God about the coming flood and the need for accountability. These texts show that Second Temple Judaism was intensely concerned with both supernatural and human responsibility, linking the celestial and terrestrial realms. Fragments from Qumran demonstrate that the Book of Giants was not a casual story, but part of a broader educational and theological program. The text is written with care, incorporating repetition and explanations of the giants' actions, their questioning of authority, and the consequences they faced. Scribes made sure that each copy preserved the sequence of events and the moral lessons embedded within. This shows the community's intent to transmit both knowledge and ethical guidance, emphasizing the dangers of disobedience to divine order. The narrative also reflects the broader worldview of the period. Angels could rebel, humans could sin, and cosmic punishment was inevitable. The giants' enormous presence on Earth symbolizes the tangible consequences of supernatural interference. They disrupted society, destroyed resources, and introduced corruption, creating a world in which divine intervention was necessary. This framework allowed the Qumran community and other readers to interpret contemporary troubles as part of a cosmic plan rather than random chaos. The Book of Giants also offers insight into how Jewish communities imagined the limits of divine patience and justice. Unlike the brief mention of the Nephilim in Genesis, These manuscripts detail their behavior, their fears, and the final verdict handed down from heaven. Judgment was not abstract. It was precise, inevitable, and observable in dreams, visions, and prophetic warnings. This reflects a worldview in which moral and cosmic order were deeply intertwined, and violations of one had consequences for the other. These texts are historically significant because they illustrate how seriously communities engaged with the Watcher's tradition. The Book of Giants was read, copied, and hidden alongside other sacred writings, demonstrating its authority and value. It was not peripheral speculation, but central to understanding divine justice, angelic responsibility, and human survival. By preserving these manuscripts, the Qumran community ensured that their vision of cosmic order, judgment, and consequence survived beyond the collapse of their world, offering later generations a glimpse into a Judaism that understood history as a stage shared by humans, angels, and giants alike. The Dead Sea Scrolls reveal a universe that was far from neutral or random. In texts like the War Scroll, copied during the 1st century before Christ and preserved at Qumran, the world is depicted as a battlefield between forces of light and darkness. These were not abstract concepts, but active powers, represented by angels, humans, and demonic adversaries. The scrolls describe strategies, formations, and divine interventions, showing that the community understood life and history as a continuation of cosmic conflict. The War Scroll presents a highly structured vision. It divides the faithful into camps, assigns leaders, and gives instructions for weapons, ritual, and timing. The goal is not conquest for territory, but the alignment of the world with divine order. The forces of darkness are associated with corruption, lawlessness, and the Watcher's legacy, while the forces of light represent purity, obedience, and divine guidance. These texts suggest that the community saw every aspect of life, from moral choices to political events, through the lens of this cosmic struggle. Sectarian writings from Qumran reinforce this perspective. They describe angels who support human allies and demonic powers who mislead the wicked. Members of the community were trained to recognize these forces, to separate themselves from corruption, and to act in ways that supported divine plans. Laws, ritual observances, and communal discipline were not merely social rules. They were tactics, a larger battle that spanned heaven and earth, linking everyday life with cosmic stakes. The emphasis on cosmic war also explains why secrecy and preservation were so important. The community believed that knowledge, texts, and ritual precision could influence outcomes. The scrolls themselves were a form of preparation, a record of strategies and divine commands that ensured the faithful could participate in the ultimate victory of light over darkness. The desert location, isolation, and careful copying of manuscripts reflect a belief that these materials were powerful, and that they had to be protected from enemies who would misuse or destroy them. This worldview shaped how the Qumran community understood history. Events such as Roman occupation, local revolts, and natural disasters were not random, but interpreted as signs of the ongoing struggle between light and darkness. Cosmic war was not only a future expectation, but a present reality. Observing, praying, and living according to divine instructions were ways to influence the outcome of this conflict, showing that theology and action were inseparable in this worldview. The scrolls also influenced later Jewish and early Christian thought. Angels, demons, and cosmic battles appear repeatedly in apocalyptic literature, often echoing the patterns seen at Qumran. The idea that human history is intertwined with supernatural forces, and that obedience and preparation determine outcomes, became central to apocalyptic expectation. The Qumran manuscripts demonstrate that for at least one Jewish sect in the 1st century before and after Christ, the universe itself was a stage of war, and every choice mattered in the unseen conflict that shaped time, morality, and destiny. The Qumran community was not simply religious. It was disciplined and highly organized around rules that governed every aspect of life. These rules covered ritual purity, communal living, property, prayer, and even behavior during meals. The texts describe procedures for initiation, penalties for breaking regulations, and daily routines that ensured members remained aligned with the group's vision of holiness. Following these rules was not optional. Obedience defined belonging, and transgression was a threat to both individual and communal survival. One of the most striking points of contention within and around the community was the calendar. The Qumran sect used a solar calendar divided into 364 days, which differed from the lunar calendar used by the temple authorities in Jerusalem. This difference affected the timing of festivals, sacrifices, and other sacred observances. Disagreement over the calendar was not a trivial technicality. It represented competing claims to religious authority and correct interpretation of divine law. Choosing the wrong day could invalidate ritual practice and separate the faithful from God's favor. Texts like the Damascus document and the community rule show that members of the sect saw themselves as a faithful remnant, preserving the correct way of observing God's law. They believed that the wider Jewish world had become corrupted, whether by improper calendar use, temple leadership, or failure to maintain purity. This separation reinforced a sense of identity and purpose. It also shows that orthodoxy in this period was fluid, contested, and deeply tied to daily practice rather than only belief. The emphasis on purity extended beyond rituals. Meals were communal, and washing before eating was strictly enforced. Physical separation from those deemed impure helped maintain spiritual integrity. These practices were interpreted as preparation for the final judgment, a way to align with divine order and stand with the forces of light described in other Qumran texts. Rules were a form of strategy in a cosmic struggle, not just social convenience. Disputes about calendars and purity were not limited to theoretical debate. They created real tension with neighboring Jewish groups. Communities that followed different practices were seen as misguided or even corrupt. Letters, admonitions, and polemical texts indicate ongoing friction between the Qumran sect and outsiders, including the priestly establishment in Jerusalem. These disputes reflect the diversity of Judaism in the 1st century before Christ and the 1st century after, showing that there was no single unified religious practice. By carefully copying and preserving their texts, the Qumran community ensured that their interpretation of law, ritual, and cosmic order could survive beyond immediate political pressures. Their strict rules and unique calendar demonstrate a society deeply committed to its version of truth, one willing to separate from the mainstream to maintain integrity. These manuscripts reveal that holiness was not abstract, but enforced, debated, and measured against both time and behavior, emphasizing the contested nature of orthodoxy in the Second Temple period. In the year 66 after Christ, tensions that had been building across Judea erupted into open revolt against Roman rule. Heavy taxation, Political corruption and resentment toward the occupying forces had pushed the population to a breaking point. Cities became centers of rebellion, while villages fortified themselves in preparation for conflict. The revolt was not a single event, but a series of coordinated uprisings that reflected both desperation and determination to resist foreign control. The Roman response was overwhelming. Legions under experienced commanders moved swiftly to suppress the rebellion. By 70 after Christ, Jerusalem itself became the focus of siege. The city's defenses were breached, and the Second Temple, the central place of Jewish worship, was destroyed. This event was catastrophic, not only religiously, but culturally and politically. The loss of the temple removed the focal point of Jewish law, leadership, and daily ritual, leaving communities scattered, disoriented, and under threat. It was during this period of extreme danger that texts were hidden. Communities like those at Qumran had already been aware of the risks posed by Roman authority. The scrolls, many copied over decades, contained laws, prophecies, commentaries, and apocalyptic visions that could be misinterpreted or used against their owners. By placing manuscripts in jars and caves, the communities preserved their traditions in a form resistant to destruction, ensuring that knowledge survived even if people did not. The destruction of the temple also created urgency. Texts associated with ritual practice, calendars, and sacred law became impossible to maintain in the usual settings. Sacred objects, scrolls, and records faced confiscation or burning. Hiding these works was not an act of secrecy for secrecy's sake, but a practical measure to protect the religious and cultural heritage of the people. The desert, distant from Rome's immediate oversight, provided a place where manuscripts could remain intact for centuries. Historical sources, including Josephus, describe the scale of the devastation. Thousands were killed, and many were enslaved. Families fled to remote areas, while communities that had remained organized attempted to preserve what they could. The Qumran sect's decision to conceal scrolls aligns with this broader pattern. These actions reflect foresight and planning in the face of overwhelming force, demonstrating that survival of ideas was as crucial as survival of individuals. The revolt and the fall of Jerusalem also marked a turning point in Jewish history. Centralized religious authority shifted, messianic expectations intensified, and communities became more dispersed. In this context, the hidden scrolls represent both continuity and adaptation. They were repositories of knowledge, law, and belief that would survive the chaos of war and the imposition of foreign control. Preserving them was an act of defiance, a commitment to memory, and a strategy to protect the integrity of a worldview that might otherwise have been erased. By understanding the events of 66 to 70 after Christ, it becomes clear why the scrolls were hidden and why their preservation mattered. The destruction of the temple was not just a physical loss, but a signal that human and divine order had been disrupted. In response, communities acted to ensure that the lessons, rules, and visions contained in their manuscripts would remain, waiting for a future where they could be recovered and studied, and where the voices of the past could speak again despite the violence of their time. The caves near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea became more than rocky shelters. They were time capsules, spaces deliberately chosen to protect knowledge from destruction. During the 1st century after Christ, as Roman legions advanced and Jewish communities faced annihilation, these caves provided a secure location for preserving manuscripts, scrolls, and Fragments of religious and legal texts. Their isolation and natural concealment made them ideal for safeguarding material that might otherwise have been lost forever. Scrolls were placed in jars, carefully sealed with clay or cloth, often accompanied by smaller containers for fragile fragments. This method was simple, but highly effective. The jars protected against moisture, dust, and insects, creating a microenvironment in which parchment and papyrus could survive for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows that many of these containers were intentionally positioned in recesses, behind rocks, or within hidden alcoves, demonstrating foresight and planning by the communities responsible for the texts. The preservation of the scrolls was not only a practical matter, but a strategic one. The manuscripts contained law, prophecy, commentary, and cosmological vision that could have been considered dangerous or subversive if discovered by Roman authorities or rival Jewish factions. By hiding them in stone and clay, the communities ensured that knowledge could endure without interference. The caves functioned as a control archive, a library hidden within the desert, waiting for a time when the texts could be recovered safely. Fragments found across multiple caves show that the Qumran community and others were systematic in their approach. They did not scatter documents randomly. Texts were grouped according to type or importance. Biblical manuscripts, Enochic texts, hymns, and sectarian writings were often found in separate jars or spaces, suggesting an understanding of organization and priority. The placement of these scrolls was not accidental, but intentional, reflecting the value assigned to each text. The environment of the Dead Sea region also contributed to preservation. The arid climate, low humidity, and stable temperature within caves slowed the natural decay of parchment and papyrus. Combined with human intervention, these factors allowed manuscripts to survive almost intact for nearly 2,000 years. The discovery of the scrolls in the 20th century confirmed the effectiveness of these measures and provided a rare window into Jewish thought, practice, and scripture during the Second Temple period. Hiding a library in stone also symbolized the importance of what it contained. These were not ordinary documents. They were guides to life, law, and cosmic understanding, preserved in a manner that emphasized care, secrecy, and reverence. Each jar, each carefully placed scroll, represents both practical ingenuity and a philosophical statement about the value of memory. Caves as time capsules show that knowledge can be protected even when societies collapse, and that foresight can create continuity across centuries. The Qumran manuscripts survived because someone understood the fragility of both life and written record. By sealing texts in stone, communities ensured that the voice of the past could speak to future generations, a silent but powerful act of preservation that defied destruction and time itself. The early Christian movement did not emerge in isolation. It arose within the context of Second Temple Judaism, inheriting its scriptures, traditions, and worldviews. Jesus and his earliest followers were Jewish, and the Hebrew Bible, along with texts circulating in communities like Qumran, formed the foundation of their teachings. Ideas about angels, divine judgment, and cosmic order carried over naturally, shaping the language and imagination of early Christian preaching. Angels were no longer distant observers. They were active agents in salvation history, messengers, and participants in God's plan. Many passages in the New Testament reflect this inheritance. Angels announce births, protect individuals, deliver messages, and participate in eschatological visions. The descriptions echo language found in Enochic literature and other Jewish apocalyptic writings. The community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls viewed angels as integral to human history, and early Christians adopted this worldview, emphasizing the presence of divine agents in both ordinary and extraordinary events. The Book of Enoch, though not canonized in most Christian traditions, influenced early writers and thinkers. References appear in the Epistle of Jude, where a quotation from Enoch emphasizes judgment and accountability. This demonstrates that Jewish traditions preserved in the desert had a lasting impact. Angels described as watchers, messengers, and executors of divine will continued to shape Christian theology, eschatology, and imagination. Early Christians also inherited the moral framework associated with angels. Obedience, purity, vigilance, and awareness of spiritual forces were central to both Qumran and early Christian teachings. The emphasis on separating from corrupt influences, living righteously, and participating in a cosmic struggle is a continuity from Second Temple Judaism into Christian ethical thought. Angels served as exemplars and intermediaries, bridging the divine and human spheres. The transmission of these ideas was not uniform. Different communities emphasized different aspects of angelology, and debates existed over the interpretation and authority of texts. Just as the Qumran sect valued particular manuscripts and rules, early Christians relied on select scriptures and oral traditions. This process of inheritance shaped the formation of Christian identity, providing tools to interpret events like the crucifixion, resurrection, and expectations of the end times. The continuity also extended to imagination and visual culture. Early Christian art and storytelling frequently depict angels as messengers and warriors, echoing motifs developed in Jewish apocalyptic literature. Angels weren't merely decorative. They carried theological meaning and reinforced a worldview in which the spiritual and temporal realms were intertwined. From Judea to the early church, the language and roles of angels illustrate the persistence of Jewish thought across cultural and religious transitions. Texts preserved in caves, copied meticulously, and hidden from destruction influence the teachings of a new religious movement. These ideas about angels as messengers, teachers, and agents of divine judgment provided a bridge between Jewish tradition and Christian expression, demonstrating that the spiritual imagination of one era can shape the beliefs, ethics, and worldview of the next in profound and enduring ways. The New Testament preserves echoes of the Watchers tradition in a few striking passages, notably in the Epistle of Jude and the Second Epistle of Peter. Jude, written in the 1st century after Christ, directly quotes from the Book of Enoch, describing angels who sinned and were cast into eternal chains awaiting judgment. This reference shows that the author assumed familiarity with traditions about rebellious angels, demonstrating continuity between Second Temple Jewish literature and early Christian teaching. In Jude, the warning is clear. Just as the Watchers were punished for crossing boundaries, so too will those who distort faith or lead others astray face divine judgment. Angels are not abstract symbols, but active participants in God's justice. The text emphasizes that disobedience has consequences, and that even celestial beings are accountable. This reflects the moral and cosmic framework inherited from texts preserved at Qumran and elsewhere. 2 Peter, likely written in the late 1st century after Christ, also references angels who sinned and were confined in chains awaiting judgment. Though the language is less explicit than Jude, the thematic parallels are evident. Both texts present a universe in which rebellion disrupts order, divine authority intervenes, and punishment is inevitable. The imagery reinforces the message that God maintains control over both heaven and earth, and that disobedience is neither private nor inconsequential. These passages demonstrate that early Christian writers were engaging with existing Jewish traditions rather than inventing entirely new concepts. The narrative of the Watchers, fallen angels, and cosmic judgment provided a framework to interpret sin, authority, and the unfolding of history. Angels in these texts serve as cautionary examples, illustrating the seriousness of rebellion and the certainty of justice. They also provide a bridge between the familiar Jewish apocalyptic worldview and emerging Christian theology. The use of Watchers imagery in the New Testament also highlights the selective incorporation of older texts. Not every detail of the Book of Enoch or related traditions is retained, but key elements, rebellious angels, chains, and impending judgment, are preserved because they resonate with the moral and theological concerns of early Christian communities. This selective adaptation shows awareness, discernment, and continuity of thought. Moreover, these passages help explain how early Christians understood the spiritual dimension of their world. Angels weren't mere messengers or background figures. They embodied divine authority, cosmic order, and the consequences of transgression. By referencing these traditions, the writers of Jude and 2 Peter connected their communities to a larger history of belief while reinforcing ethical instruction and anticipation of divine judgment. The echoes of the Watchers in the New Testament demonstrate that early Christianity did not emerge in a vacuum. It inherited complex ideas about angels, rebellion, and judgment from Second Temple Judaism, and adapted them to address its own concerns. The texts preserve the moral urgency, cosmic perspective, and spiritual intensity of the Watchers' tradition, showing that even centuries later, the story of fallen angels remained a powerful tool to teach, warn, and shape the imagination of believers. As the early church expanded in the 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ, leaders faced the challenge of defining doctrine while addressing a wide variety of texts and traditions. Stories of angels, particularly those inherited from Jewish apocalyptic literature, raised difficult questions. Were angels literal beings with physical form? Could they interact sexually with humans, as the Watchers' story suggested? Were these tales meant to be symbolic, allegorical, or factual? Church authorities debated these issues because how they answered shaped belief, ethics, and the boundaries of orthodoxy. The Book of Enoch and related traditions described angels in vivid, corporeal terms. They descended from heaven, married, and taught humans forbidden knowledge. For some believers, taking these stories literally threatened the Church's emerging theological structure. Literal angels who sinned could challenge ideas about divine perfection, the uniqueness of human sin, and the nature of salvation. Leaders feared that misinterpretation could spread heresy or undermine the moral authority of Scripture. Church fathers, such as Augustine and later theologians, wrestled with these issues, seeking to classify texts and ideas. Some argued that angelic narratives were allegorical, meant to illustrate moral lessons about obedience and pride. Others accepted certain aspects of angelic reality, such as their role as messengers and guides, while rejecting literal interpretations of sexual activity. These debates illustrate how early Christian communities worked to transform story into doctrine, distinguishing between tradition that could inform belief and narrative that could mislead. The danger of literal angels extended beyond theology into communal life. If believers treated stories of rebellious angels as historical events, they might imitate, fear, or misapply the lessons. Misunderstandings could lead to obsession with forbidden knowledge, speculation about secret histories, or the belief that cosmic forces could justify immoral behavior. Leaders sought to guide communities away from such risks while preserving the moral and spiritual value of the texts. This process of doctrinal negotiation also involved the selection of authoritative scripture. Texts that included detailed accounts of the Watchers and giants were influential in the 1st century after Christ, but gradually fell out of the canon. The Church emphasized writings that supported ethical teaching, salvation, and coherent cosmology. Apocryphal works were either excluded, treated with caution, or interpreted allegorically. By controlling which stories were taught and how they were understood, leaders shaped collective memory and maintained stability. The debates over angelic bodies and sexuality reveal a broader pattern in early Christianity. Stories inherited from Second Temple Judaism were powerful, but potentially disruptive. By distinguishing allegory from fact, church leaders codified beliefs about angels, the nature of evil, and human responsibility. They created a framework in which angels could guide, warn, and protect without undermining divine authority or moral order. In short, the Church's handling of angelic narratives illustrates the tension between inherited stories and institutional control. Leaders preserved the moral and spiritual insights of these texts while mitigating the dangers of literal interpretation. The result was a careful balance. Angels remained active in imagination, teaching, and worship, but their bodies, sexuality, and rebellion were framed in ways that served doctrine rather than destabilized it, shaping Christian thought for centuries to come. By the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ, the Christian Church began to formalize its canon, distinguishing authoritative scripture from other influential texts. This process was not sudden, but gradual, shaped by theological debate, practical use in worship, and the need to maintain unity across increasingly widespread communities. Texts that had circulated widely, including the Book of Enoch, were evaluated for their consistency with emerging doctrine, their moral instruction, and their perceived authenticity. Over time, certain works were included in liturgy and teaching, while others were relegated to the margins or excluded entirely. The Book of Enoch, once highly respected in some Jewish and early Christian circles, experienced a shift in status, especially in the Latin-speaking West. Latin church leaders were less familiar with the Aramaic and Ge'ez manuscripts that preserved Enochic literature, and translations were limited or incomplete. The themes of rebellious angels, giants, and detailed cosmology raised theological concerns. Literal interpretations conflicted with the developing orthodoxy, particularly ideas about angelic perfection, human sin, and the final judgment. These concerns contributed to the gradual marginalization of Enoch in Western Christianity. Communities naturally sorted texts according to use and doctrinal reliability. Writings that could unify teaching, support worship, and be copied efficiently gained prominence. Those that were controversial, complex, or regionally limited were less likely to be widely adopted. Enochic texts, with their vivid descriptions and cosmological complexity, fell into this latter category. In contrast, texts that later became the canonical Old and New Testament books were increasingly recognized as authoritative, forming the backbone of Christian teaching in both East and West. Despite its marginalization in the Latin West, Enoch continued to influence thought indirectly. Quotations in Jude and thematic parallels in other New Testament writings preserved aspects of its worldview, particularly regarding angels and judgment. The persistence of these motifs demonstrates that even when a text is excluded from formal canon, its ideas can survive and shape belief. Scholars in the Latin Church often had limited access to the full range of Enochic literature, which reinforced its secondary status. But fragments and references maintained a subtle presence in theological discussion. The process of canon formation also reflects the broader challenges of standardizing religious texts across diverse communities. Local traditions, linguistic differences, and differing theological emphases created a complex landscape. Leaders had to balance inclusivity with clarity, ensuring that Scripture supported teaching while avoiding texts that could generate confusion or division. Enoch, rich in narrative and symbolism, did not meet these criteria in many Latin contexts, leading to its retreat from mainstream circulation. By the 5th century after Christ, the canon lines were largely established in the Latin West. Scripture was defined, taught, and copied systematically, while Enoch and other apocryphal works remained on the periphery. Their survival depended on isolated communities, translations into other languages, and the occasional reference in theological debate. The history of Enoch's marginalization illustrates how canon formation is both selective and strategic, privileging certain texts to preserve doctrinal coherence, while relegating others to the edges of religious memory. This process shaped the landscape of Western Christianity for centuries to come. As Christianity developed in the Latin West during the 4th and 5th centuries after Christ, church leaders faced a growing theological challenge. The Watcher's narrative, with its detailed accounts of angels descending to earth, marrying and producing giants, conflicted with emerging doctrines about the nature of angels and divine order. Angels in these texts were portrayed with physicality, desires, and agency that complicated official teachings about their spiritual purity and immaterial essence. Church authorities increasingly viewed these stories as theologically risky and potentially misleading. Western theologians preferred a conceptual framework in which angels were wholly spiritual, incorporeal beings. This allowed for clear distinctions between human and divine, sin and obedience, and avoided questions about angelic sexuality, reproduction, or interference in human history. By emphasizing immateriality and moral perfection, the Church could maintain consistency in preaching, catechesis, and liturgy, and avoid interpretations that might encourage speculation or heretical belief. The problem of physical angels was not simply abstract. Literal readings of the Watchers suggested that divine beings could violate divine law, reproduce with humans, and influence the material world in ways that threatened the unique role of Christ and human responsibility. Such ideas undermined the carefully constructed theological system that Western Christianity was consolidating, where sin, salvation, and cosmic order had to be understood within the boundaries of Scripture and tradition. The vividness of the Watcher's narrative made these issues difficult to ignore. In response, leaders and scholars selectively interpreted or ignored texts that suggested corporeal angels. Enochic writings, the Book of Giants, and related apocryphal materials were increasingly categorized as secondary, allegorical, or dangerous. Church councils and theologians emphasized approved biblical accounts that described angels as messengers, protectors, and worshippers, without the complications of physicality. Art, preaching, and teaching reinforced this model, creating a consistent and controllable understanding of angelic beings. The preference for safer angel frameworks also served social and pastoral purposes. Literal angels with human traits could inspire curiosity, fear, or imitation, particularly among the uneducated or impressionable. Allegorical interpretations reduced these risks by transforming vivid narratives into moral lessons or cosmic principles. Angels could remain present and influential in religious life, guiding, warning, and participating in divine plans, but without undermining doctrinal authority or encouraging speculation about forbidden knowledge. This shift demonstrates how early Western Christianity negotiated inherited traditions. Stories from Second Temple Judaism were rich and compelling, but not all aspects fit with the emerging institutional and theological framework. By redefining angels as purely spiritual and morally impeccable, the Church preserved key moral and eschatological functions, while eliminating elements that could destabilize belief. The Watcher's narrative, once central to Jewish apocalyptic imagination, became a cautionary tale, its vivid imagery adapted, minimized, or sidelined to ensure coherence in Western Christian teaching. In effect, the theological problem of two physical angels illustrates the broader process of doctrinal consolidation. Texts weren't rejected arbitrarily, but evaluated for compatibility with a system that sought clarity, authority, and stability. The stories of the Watchers persisted in memory, scholarship, and marginal writings, but Western Christianity increasingly relied on controlled frameworks, emphasizing angels as spiritual intermediaries, entirely separate from human corporeality and fully aligned with divine will. Even as the angelic traditions of the Watchers and the Book of Enoch were sidelined in the Latin West, they did not disappear entirely. Manuscripts, translations, and commentaries preserved these ideas in other regions and languages. In the Ge'ez-speaking Ethiopian Church, the Book of Enoch was fully canonized and copied extensively, providing a living tradition where the stories of fallen angels, giants, and cosmic judgment remained central to religious thought. These texts demonstrate that what was marginalized in Rome-centered Christianity continued to influence belief and practice elsewhere. Greek and Syriac Christian communities also retained fragments and references to Enochic and angelic narratives. Commentators occasionally cited these materials to explain scripture, interpret visions, or explore eschatology. The focus on angels as mediators, messengers, and agents of divine judgment persisted in these traditions, even if the explicit corporeal and rebellious elements were toned down or allegorized. These surviving echoes indicate that the early debates about angelic nature did not eliminate interest or engagement with the material. Rabbinic Judaism, developing after the destruction of the Second Temple, preserved aspects of angelic thought in commentary and mystical texts. Angels were frequently mentioned as messengers, record keepers, and participants in divine plans. While the explicit stories of watchers and giants were less prominent, motifs such as heavenly councils, punishment for transgression, and the moral oversight of celestial beings continue to shape theological imagination. Jewish texts in the first millennium after Christ reflect continuity with Second Temple literature, showing that traditions could persist even outside canonical scripture. The process of preservation also involved adaptation. Scribes, translators, and theologians frequently reinterpreted older stories to fit new doctrinal frameworks. Enochic and angelic material that could support moral instruction, illustrate divine justice, or enhance apocalyptic expectation was retained, while elements deemed theologically risky, such as angelic sexuality or rebellion, were minimized or explained allegorically. This careful curation ensured survival without threatening the coherence of emerging orthodoxies. Geographical diversity played a key role. Regions beyond the immediate control of Rome and the Latin Church were able to maintain and transmit these texts. Ethiopian, Syriac, and some Greek communities continued to value Enoch and related angelic literature, copying manuscripts and incorporating them into teaching. These traditions acted as repositories of knowledge that might have been lost entirely in Western Europe, ensuring that the intellectual and spiritual richness of Second Temple angelology survived for future generations. Even within the Latin West, traces of these traditions persisted in commentary, marginal notes, and scholastic references. Although the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants were not widely circulated, their influence is detectable in theological discussion, moral exemplars, and symbolic interpretation. Echoes of the Watchers appear in medieval angelology, mystical writings, and apocalyptic thought, demonstrating the enduring power of these narratives. The story of what was forgotten and what was preserved illustrates that textual and theological traditions are never entirely lost. Marginalized texts, if copied, discussed, or translated, can survive in hidden or peripheral contexts. The angelic imagination of the Second Temple period lived on, not always in plain sight, but in commentary, liturgy, and regional canons, offering evidence that ideas about divine agents and cosmic order could endure beyond doctrinal exclusion and geographic isolation. The Ethiopian Christian tradition has played a unique role in preserving the Book of Enoch in its entirety. Unlike the Latin West, where Enochic texts were sidelined and largely lost from the canon, the Ethiopian Church recognized First Enoch as authoritative scripture and ensured its transmission through continuous copying and translation into Ge'ez, the liturgical language of the Church. This preservation created a parallel memory of Second Temple angelology and apocalyptic thought that endured outside the boundaries of Western canon. First, Enoch includes detailed accounts of the Watchers, their descent to earth, their rebellion, and the resulting judgment, along with visions of heaven and prophecy. These elements, marginalized or excluded in the Latin West, remained central in Ethiopian Christianity, influencing teaching, interpretation, and liturgical practice. By maintaining the full text, the Ethiopian Church ensured that future generations could access a version of Jewish apocalyptic literature that had been effectively lost elsewhere for over a millennium. The survival of First Enoch in Ethiopia highlights the significance of geographical and cultural context in the transmission of texts. Ethiopian Christians had contact with both early Jewish communities and Syriac Christianity, providing channels through which these manuscripts could be copied, preserved, and interpreted. The stability of monastic institutions and the commitment to scriptural preservation in Ethiopia allowed First Enoch to remain intact even as surrounding regions lost access to these writings. This preserved tradition offers historians and theologians an invaluable resource. It allows scholars to study angelology, cosmology, and apocalyptic literature in ways that are nearly impossible, using only Latin or Greek sources. The vivid descriptions of angels, giants, and heavenly judgment provide insights into the beliefs and imagination of Jewish and early Christian communities. The Ethiopian manuscripts also show how texts could be adapted to local liturgical and theological needs while retaining core narratives. First, Enoch's survival in Ethiopia also underscores the interplay between canon and community. While Rome-centered Christianity excluded Enoch from its authoritative texts, Ethiopian Christians valued it for teaching, moral guidance, and eschatological insight. This divergence illustrates that what is considered canonical or authoritative can depend as much on local tradition and interpretation as on institutional decree. The Ethiopian canon preserved a form of memory that complements, challenges, and enriches the understanding of early Christian and Jewish thought. The Book of Enoch in Ethiopia remained influential well into the medieval period and continues to be studied today. Its preservation demonstrates that ideas about the Watchers, angels, and divine judgment could endure outside dominant cultural centers. Scholars have used these manuscripts to reconstruct Second Temple traditions, understand the transmission of apocalyptic thought, and explore the diversity of early Christianity. Ethiopia's role in keeping First Enoch alive shows that religious memory is not confined to the most powerful or centralized authorities. Even texts marginalized in the West could survive through dedicated communities, careful copying, and cultural prioritization. This preservation ensures that the rich, imaginative, and complex traditions of the Second Temple period remain accessible, providing a crucial parallel memory to Western canonical histories, and reminding us that history and scripture are often maintained in unexpected corners of the world. In the year 1947, a Bedouin shepherd wandering near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea made a discovery that would transform the study of ancient Jewish texts. Searching for a lost goat, he stumbled upon a hidden cave, and inside found jars containing rolled manuscripts. These manuscripts, later identified as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, included biblical books, sectarian writings, and previously unknown compositions. The find turned centuries of rumor and scholarly speculation into concrete evidence, providing a direct connection to the religious and literary world of the Second Temple period. The scrolls included texts in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, showing the linguistic diversity of the communities that produced them. Among the materials were fragments of the Book of Enoch, the Book of Giants, and other apocalyptic and angelic writings. These manuscripts confirmed that traditions once dismissed as peripheral or legendary were indeed part of the textual landscape of early Judaism. The discovery demonstrated that groups like those at Qumran were engaged in careful copying, preservation, and interpretation of sacred texts, emphasizing both continuity and innovation in religious thought. Archaeologists quickly realized the significance of the find. The scrolls dated from the 3rd century before Christ to the 1st century after Christ, covering a period of intense religious, social, and political activity. They provided evidence of a community deeply concerned with law, ritual purity, and the cosmic struggle between forces of light and darkness. The survival of these manuscripts in jars hidden within caves revealed the practical and deliberate methods of preservation used to protect knowledge from conflict and upheaval. The Qumran discovery also transformed understanding of angelology and apocalyptic literature. Previously, scholars had relied on texts like the Book of Enoch only through quotations in other works or through partial translations. The physical manuscripts allowed for direct study, comparison, and analysis. Patterns in handwriting, composition, and textual variants showed that multiple scribes were involved over generations, indicating sustained engagement with these narratives. Angels, giants, and cosmic judgment, once confined to imagination and secondary citation, became subjects of empirical study. The accidental nature of the discovery emphasizes the fragility and contingency of historical knowledge. For nearly 2,000 years, these texts lay hidden, invisible, yet preserved, awaiting chance and circumstance to bring them to light. The Bedouin shepherd's find was the catalyst that allowed modern scholarship to confirm the existence of a textual world that had been hinted at, debated, and partially reconstructed through references in later Christian and Jewish writings. The year 1947 marked a turning point in the study of ancient Judaism and early Christianity. Manuscripts once relegated to legend could now be examined directly, revealing the depth and diversity of Second Temple thought. The scrolls provided context for early Christian angelology, Jewish law, and apocalyptic expectations, showing that what had survived was only a portion of a rich literary and religious tradition. The accidental discovery at Qumran reopened a chapter of history long sealed in stone and clay, giving scholars, students, and the curious world access to voices that had remained silent for centuries. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls prompted rigorous scholarly analysis to determine their age, origin, and significance. Radiocarbon dating, paleography, and textual reconstruction became essential tools in this effort. Radiocarbon dating of parchment and papyrus placed many scrolls between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after Christ, confirming that these manuscripts were produced during the late Second Temple period. This timeline aligns with the historical context of Jewish sects living under Roman rule and the intense religious debates of the era. Paleography, the study of ancient handwriting, allowed researchers to identify multiple scribes and different stages of textual transmission. Variations in script style and ink indicate that these texts were copied and recopied over generations. This suggests that the community responsible for the scrolls valued the preservation of knowledge and invested in the careful transmission of their writings. The complexity of the scripts also demonstrates the sophistication of scribal practices and the centrality of literacy and learning in these groups. Reconstruction of fragmented scrolls revealed the content and thematic emphasis of the texts. Biblical books were present alongside commentaries, apocalyptic writings, and community rules. Notably, texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants highlight the prominence of angels in the worldview of some Jewish groups. Angels were described as messengers, warriors, judges, and participants in cosmic events. Their activity shaped human history, morality, and the unfolding of divine judgment. The prominence of angelic narratives indicates that these beings were not peripheral, but central to the community's religious imagination and ethical understanding. The study of fragments also clarified relationships between texts. Some manuscripts overlap with portions of biblical books, while others expand on apocalyptic traditions or interpret scripture through the lens of cosmic struggle. Scholars noted that the repeated attention to angels, cosmic battles, and divine order reflects a coherent worldview that integrated law, prophecy, and eschatology. These ideas influenced early Christian thought, as evidenced by references in the New Testament and other early writings. Dating and reconstruction further illuminated the historical context. The manuscripts were produced during a time of political tension, Roman occupation, and sectarian division in Judea. These conditions likely influenced the emphasis on divine agents and the cosmic struggle between good and evil. Angels, in this framework, provided both moral exemplars and instruments of divine justice, offering guidance and reassurance to communities facing uncertainty and persecution. The combination of radiocarbon dating, paleography, and textual reconstruction allowed scholars to map a timeline of ideas, showing continuity and development across centuries. Angelic narratives, once thought marginal or legendary, emerged as central features of religious thought during the late Second Temple period. The scrolls demonstrate that these communities were deeply concerned with cosmic order, morality, and the consequences of human and divine action. This evidence reshapes understanding of Jewish thought before the destruction of the Temple, revealing a world in which angels were not abstract symbols, but active participants in history and belief. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide remarkable insight into the diversity of Judaism during the late Second Temple period, but they do not confirm sensational claims about secret histories or conspiracies. Radiocarbon dating, paleography, and careful textual analysis establish that the manuscripts were produced between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after Christ. This allows scholars to draw firm conclusions about the age of the texts, the scribal practices involved, and the communities that valued and preserved them. The scrolls demonstrate that multiple Jewish groups existed with differing interpretations of scripture, ritual observance, and eschatological expectation. The scrolls reveal a complex religious landscape. Some texts are biblical copies, others are commentaries explaining the law or scripture, and still others are sectarian writings that detail community rules, purity codes, and apocalyptic visions. Together, these manuscripts illustrate the variety of thought, practice, and belief within Judaism, showing that there was no single orthodox approach at the time. The prominence of angelic narratives, cosmic struggle, and apocalyptic imagery reflects theological concerns shared by some communities, not universal doctrine. Textual transmission is another area clarified by the scrolls. Multiple scribes copied manuscripts over generations, producing slight variations in wording, spelling, and organization. This demonstrates a careful but dynamic process of preservation, showing that texts were living documents rather than fixed and unchanging. The consistency of core themes, however, such as angelology and eschatology, confirms that certain ideas were widely respected and influential, shaping community identity and moral instruction. Despite the richness of the material, the scrolls do not support exaggerations or conspiratorial theories. They do not provide secret prophecies, hidden histories of empires, or knowledge withheld by a single authority. Popular claims that the scrolls contain forbidden or mystical knowledge beyond what is already documented in Jewish and early Christian traditions are not borne out by the evidence. The manuscripts reflect the concerns, beliefs, and practices of particular communities, not a universal hidden history. What the scrolls prove is the diversity and sophistication of Jewish thought in the centuries leading up to and following the birth of Christianity. They provide tangible evidence of the religious imagination, textual skill, and moral frameworks that shaped communities in Judea. Scholars can trace the influence of these texts on early Christian writings, particularly in themes such as angels, judgment, and eschatology, but they must do so with caution, distinguishing between documented evidence and speculative interpretation. In sum, the Dead Sea Scrolls offer a window into the past, illuminating the range of beliefs, textual practices, and religious creativity present during a pivotal period of Jewish history. They confirm the existence of complex angelic narratives and apocalyptic thought, the careful preservation of scripture, and the diversity of Jewish sects. They do not, however, provide proof of hidden global histories, secret conspiracies, or knowledge deliberately suppressed. Separating what the scrolls actually demonstrate from exaggeration is essential for responsible scholarship and understanding the religious and historical context of these extraordinary manuscripts. The Dead Sea Scrolls compel modern readers to reconsider a world in which angels weren't abstract symbols, but active, sometimes dangerous participants in history. Texts from the 3rd century before Christ to the 1st century. After Christ revealed communities that believed angels could intervene directly in human affairs, teach forbidden knowledge, and even transgress divine boundaries. These ideas were central to the worldview of certain Jewish groups living in Judea under Roman occupation, illustrating a spiritual landscape far more vivid and immediate than later doctrinal abstractions would allow. The scrolls show that angels were perceived as messengers, judges, and warriors, closely involved in the moral and cosmic order. The Watchers, fallen angels who married and produced giants, embody the potential for celestial beings to disrupt the human and divine balance. These narratives were not merely entertaining stories. They carried ethical weight, warning communities about obedience, divine justice, and the consequences of transgression. The vividness of these angels challenged later church leaders, prompting reinterpretation and doctrinal caution. Rome and the Latin West gradually reframed angelology to emphasize immaterial, morally perfect beings. Stories of corporeal angels and transgression were downplayed, removed from canon, or allegorized to preserve theological consistency. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Giants, and related texts were marginalized, yet their existence persisted in fragments, translations, and distant traditions such as the Ethiopian Church. The contrast between these marginal texts and the official canon reveals the selective memory and doctrinal control exercised by ecclesiastical authorities. The preservation of these manuscripts outside the Latin West, especially in Ethiopia, and the accidental discovery at Qumran in 1947, remind us that religious history is never fully erased. What Rome tried to outgrow, angels with agency, moral ambiguity, and cosmic influence, survived in diverse forms, allowing modern scholars to reconstruct a more nuanced understanding of Second Temple Judaism. These texts reveal a period in which divine and human worlds were intertwined, and where spiritual realities were immediate and consequential rather than abstract theological concepts. The scrolls also highlight the interplay between fear, morality, and imagination. Angels were both revered and feared, symbols of divine power and potential chaos. Communities invested in copying, preserving, and interpreting these texts, demonstrating the seriousness with which they approached spiritual authority and cosmic order. Modern readers are confronted with a reality in which celestial beings were integral to ethics, law, and eschatological expectation. Ultimately, the Dead Sea Scrolls teach that religious imagination in the first centuries before and after Christ was more fluid and daring than later orthodoxy would permit. Angels weren't distant symbols, but participants whose actions demanded attention and ethical reflection. Rome sought to simplify, control, and contain these ideas. But the manuscripts show that for centuries, human communities wrestled with beings that were near enough to touch, instruct, and threaten. The scrolls close the story by reminding us that the spiritual world of the past was tangible, morally charged, and deeply entwined with human life, forcing modern readers to acknowledge a religious imagination that was far closer, far stranger, and far more immediate than the sanitized versions preserved in later Western tradition.